Question I get very often: how do you keep a safe distance from the parked cars on the side? Well, this is something that will only come with experience. What you can do until then is to look far in the center of your lane to stay as centered as possible. If you're well centered on your lane and the cars are well parked too, you should be okay. Of course, if a vehicle is parked a bit further from the curb and very close, then you'll need to be more careful and look closer to determine the distance. I'll discuss that in more detail in a future video. Now, I could give you some reference points to determine the distance between you and the cars on the side, like how high you see their door handle or mirror relative to the bottom of your side window. But there are two major problems with this. First, you obviously don't want to be looking to the side while you're moving forward. You can do that when moving very slowly, like when aligning yourself to park, for example, but not when moving at normal speeds. Second, vehicles are of varied heights, and so are people. Door handles might be higher or lower on some vehicles, mirrors too, so there are just too many variables. For example, I'm 6 feet tall. When looking to the right, I see this, a taller person would see this, a shorter person would see this. So basically, to keep a safe distance from the parked cars, you should try to stay centered in the lane as much as possible. For that, look far in the center of your lane, and the rest will come with experience. Even on very narrow streets like this one, if the city allows cars to be parked on both sides, that means that the street was built so that there's enough room for both the parked vehicles and for a vehicle in the middle of the lane. If the street would be too narrow, they would forbid parking on at least one side, or both, in case the street is even narrower. Be careful though, if you drive a larger than average vehicle, like a pickup truck or SUV. You should still fit, because the street is supposed to be wide enough for them, but you'll have to be more careful not to swerve too much. The larger your vehicle, the more you should slow down. If you're not sure that there's enough room for your vehicle, just take another street if possible. Side note, if you park your vehicle on a very narrow street and you have foldable mirrors, I highly recommend you fold them. If you're driving on a very narrow street with no parked cars, same thing. Look far at the center of your lane to stay centered. If you're driving in the snow and you can't see the lines on the asphalt, try following the tracks that the other vehicles have traced. That's usually the right distance from the parked cars. As for vehicles stopped on the side of the road, if they're inside their lane and you're centered in yours, you should be okay. Beware though that there might be movement around the vehicle. For example, the driver might appear from behind the truck, so again, slow down and be ready to brake. Side note, as I was approaching, I saw this guy flashing to the right, and the position of the car and the turned front wheel are also indicating that he wants to get out of his parking spot. So be especially careful when passing between him and the truck. Be on the lookout for hints like this. If you're on a street with multiple lanes, the best thing to do is to change lanes before reaching the vehicle if possible. It's the same principle as the move over law, where you need to leave at least one lane between you and an emergency or maintenance vehicle if there are enough lanes available. If you're driving in one of those streets where you're always wondering if the right lane is wide enough, just change lanes whenever possible. Problem solved. If you're on a two-way street separated by a yellow line and it's too tight, you'll have to step on the yellow line. You don't have a choice. Just make sure it's safe to do so. A common mistake with students when they need to go around an obstacle, they tend to pass too close to it because they don't want to invade the opposite lane too much. Like here, when passing this bus, I need to invade the opposite lane. I have no other choice. I checked before, the opposite lane is clear, so why would I not invade it completely? I'm already invading it and there's nobody there, so why should I be too close to the bus on the right? Now, judging your distances when driving in a very tight two-way street is a bit more complicated, so I'll talk about it in more detail in the future video which I mentioned previously. But for now, if there's room to move to the right, it's usually the vehicle that has room to move that waits for the other vehicle to pass. Also, try to anticipate. Like in this case, I see this guy coming in front and the only spot I have to move to the right is here. So I move to the right and I wait for him to pass. Always keep at least 1 meter from users or obstacles on the sides, more if possible. For example, when passing cyclists, you should keep a distance of at least 1 meter from them when driving at 50 kilometers an hour or less, and 1.5 meters when driving at more than 50. If you see that they're inside their lines and you're centered in your lane too, you should be okay. If there are enough lanes, just change lanes before you reach the cyclist. Problem solved again. If you don't think you have enough room, don't force it. Look for spots ahead where the cyclist will have enough room to move to the side, like there, and wait. Usually that's what they do when they have a chance. If you're waiting at a red light and there's a cyclist to your right, after the light turns green, when they reach the other side of the intersection, they'll tend to move to the left because of the parked vehicles. So since you're a lot faster than them, try to reach the other side of the intersection before they do. With pedestrians, same thing, always leave at least 1 to 1.5 meters. Same thing with other vulnerable users like skateboarders, rollerbladers, and so on. In conclusion, street and lane widths vary a lot according to where you are in the world. For example, in North America, in a one-way street, you can usually fit 2 normal-sized cars. Whereas in Europe, which is an old continent, some of the streets were built in the Middle Ages for horse carts in an era when parking didn't exist, so there are a lot of very narrow streets, especially in smaller towns. So keep that in mind. In the future video that I mentioned previously, I'll go into more detail about judging your distances when driving in very tight streets or when passing in tight spots between vehicles or obstacles.